Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Horvath with Space, and I'm excited to welcome George Pullen from the Milky Way Economy and Space Economist. We're excited to have a conversation about some of the things going on within the space economy and space industry today. And I've been looking forward to having this conversation for a while, so I'm glad we're able to have it today. With that, I'd like to start by just having you talk a little bit about your career path that brought you to being, a space economist, which essentially, from my perspective, you're one of a few that really are specifically focused in that. And I think that that's really exciting. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, how your career took you that path to get to where you are today.
Yes, Joe, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on. I love the podcast. What I would say my path first started a long time ago in a galaxy far away. So I say that because my father actually took my mother to Star Wars for their first date. So if it wasn't for Star Wars, I wouldn't be here. Now, you probably don't want me to go quite that far back. So we go a little less far back. I studied financial econometrics at the University of Maine. I also quickly got into portfolio management, worked as an economist and a banker for a number of banks, worked for a couple different funds. And during that time, I specialized in what I would call alternative markets and alternative assets, derivatives, commodities, swaps, and the like. That gave me a great background for my eventual transition to space. After I left those markets, I started doing work in the blockchain space. Also, prior to that, during college, I'd worked in a genetics laboratory. So I've always had a fascination for biotech. And so the background on these different types of alternative markets gave me the tool set to look at space and realize this is the next market. And this market can learn a lot from those other markets that are usually considered to be alternative or different. When we apply the lessons learned and the best practices from other industries and other economies as they've opened up, we can benefit a lot in space. And so that's where I felt my value add was coming from with Milky Way Economy. So that's what brought us to space. We got here about 5 years ago now. Back in 2018, my business partner and I started teaching classes together at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce Law School, and then a little bit later at Columbia in their summer program. Those classes were at first focused on blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and deep tech. We very quickly expanded deep tech to include space, realizing the natural alignment. And then from there, we started publishing our articles and thoughts and research on the space economy and the growing space industry and space commercialization potential. And we also ended up writing a few books in the arena as well. So that's what brought me here today.
Yeah, that's excellent. It's interesting hearing you talk about coming at how we look at the space industry as compared to other alternate markets and things like that. I've spent a lot of time kind of looking at the history of the space industry, and it really, from what I've kind of seen, it feels like, well, for one, a lot of people don't realize that space has been around a lot longer than computers and cyber, right? I mean, they talk like space is the new thing, but we were doing space long before we had, silicon chips and things like that.
100%.
So, when you really go back and look at space from the very beginning, it was always a very governmentally focused industry, right? You had you were focused on either the DoD, the intelligence community, or NASA and science. Really were the big players, and there were these primes that supported them. So there was kind of a commercial side, but really it was all around a government focused effort for the most part. In the past 10 to 15 years, as we've really switched over to being, or not switched, but added the commercial component to it that really didn't exist before. I think a lot of people look and compare it back to traditional markets, but that's interesting to hear, how you see alternate markets and that relation to space you co-authored, the book Blockchain and the Space Economy. How did that influence, your view on where the space economy is going, and what you think are going to be some of the either challenges or advantages it has, both for the commercial world and maybe also for the investors that are involved in it?
Sure. So this is the part where I do like the shameless. Where is it? Here we go. Here's no. That is my buddy Josh. All right, here's me. This is where I do the shameless self promotion. So Barnes and Noble, Amazon, other places, grab your copy. So that's one of our. So Blockchain and the Space Economy was our first book. We ended up doing a prequel after that, and then in total, I've actually been author, co-author, editor on 8 books now, related to all different types of alternative finance and economics. Space being the focus of the last 4. What I would say is that time I spent in other markets, and that time I spent looking at, as I mentioned before, options, derivatives, swaps, various commodities, and then blockchain, I realized that every time we go through this cycle, and you sort of alluded to it, every time we go through this cycle of, oh, this is something brand new, right? This is something that we've never seen before. It makes people really excited, but unfortunately, it also makes them forget that we've actually probably done something really similar before, and maybe it's only new to people in media or people in a pedestrian fashion who aren't in the weeds. And so when you take that extra step and say, okay, what sort of existing finance or economic rigor can I apply to the study of space and the study of the development of space, and now the industrialization of space and the commercialization of space, you can pull those examples from other industries in previous eras. So, for example, most recently, I was involved about 5 years ago now. Well, 5, extending back about 8 years ago now. I was involved with a lot of different crypto and blockchain research and projects. At the time, the conversation started out in much the same way. Oh, this is new. This is the latest and greatest technology. And I'm still a tremendous fan, and I believe that distributed ledger technology broadly and blockchain technology in general provides an amazing base layer for a number of things, to include space logistics, to include space infrastructure. We can dive into that later if you're interested, but it's not necessarily plowing new financial or economic ground. It's things that we need to look at and have comparable models, and we can use those comparable models to make sure that businesses are having best practices around what they should be doing for decision making, so we can build forecasts that people can navigate toward with their plans and with their own projections. And so I think that's where the connection is. I think that in our society in general today, I'm gonna blame these things, everyone's phones. We focus on something, and we think because we saw a 7-second clip about it, that it must have happened today. And to your point, no one stops and realizes, oh yeah, space has been a thing for 60 years. And if we really stop and think about it, space has been a thing even longer than that. If we go back to some of the early telescopes that were built across Europe and even here in the Americas, and if we look even further back than that, all the inspiration that our admiration for space has caused in cultures going back thousands of years, it's always been part of us. And so now it's saying, okay, now that we're going to do business in space, now that space is going to generate money down here on the ground, and technology and advancements down here on the ground, how do we frame that? Well, we frame that using existing models and applying them as best we can.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you're right. I mean, space from a sense of awe and wonder, and from a scientific perspective, or an academic pursuit, has been around for as long as humans have been around, essentially. So yeah, it certainly changes though when it becomes about money, not just about the science, right? So absolutely, which is going to lead into my next question. I've noticed a trend over the past, I'd say about a year or so, that I was going to say throw a stone, but maybe it's throw a DM on LinkedIn without hitting a space lawyer or somebody that's calling himself a space lawyer. It feels like space law is accelerating hugely, in really just the recent 6, 12, 18 months. And I think there's certainly a reason for this, but I think there's kind of there are two sides to the coin here. Of in the early part of commercial space in the last 10 to 15 years, companies were able to accelerate certain things or move quickly in certain areas because there wasn't a lot of regulation. Now we're starting to talk about more law and regulatory and policy practices, which can be good, right, to protect the environment, to ensure resources are shared appropriately, and for international relations, and for all kinds of different reasons. But it also certainly changes the speed at which you can do things, and the government influence potentially in how people work. And I'm curious your sense of how, between Department of Commerce now, FAA, other commercial regulatory bodies coming online, FCC, ITC, all these things, how you see the regulatory regime kind of changing over the next decade, and the impact that will have, good and bad, on commercial space.
No, that's a good question, and I have also taken notice of that trend. So, full disclaimer, I do, earn a living by teaching classes, or part of a living teaching classes. So and one of those is from a law school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm not a lawyer. Right, I teach economics, finance, and deep tech to lawyers, and I preface that, I make sure that's clear, because yes, there is a strong demand signal right now for space lawyers, and I think the reason that we're seeing that strong demand signal, or as you put it, you can't throw a stick without hitting a DM about a space lawyer, it's because of commerce. And what I mean by commerce is it's because of the increase in economic activity. Because when we're talking about activity historically that was predominantly coming from NASA, or coming from companies that were doing work on the behest of NASA, they were interacting, let's say, more on a one-on-one basis for what services they were providing, how they were navigating the landscape. They weren't as concerned, perhaps, nor did they need to be in their business models, about what it meant to bump into other regulators besides potentially the IRS, right? But now we're in a new phase of space and space commercialization. Now we are in a phase where we see dollars coming to bear that are not necessarily dollars that are only coming from Uncle Sam. I think it's good to do a quick true up here, right? So if we think about the amount of money that governments, broadly speaking, across the world spend on space, it's a little bit north of $100 billion. That's billion dollars. If you think about that $100 billion that is spent on space, 65 billion of it is US. Okay. That 65 billion is pretty evenly divided between NASA and Space Force. And then you, of course, have spending that's coming from other agencies. Most notably among the others would be NOAA. Mm-hmm. Okay. When you think about that amount of money, that 55 to 65 billion that's coming from US government sources, you then say, okay, if it's coming from those sources, they're interacting with regulators, but they're interacting with regulators, what I would say is more likely than not, on a very friendly manner, because they're providing services, products, and goods back and forth to the government. Now let's say, okay, what's the commercial sector look like now, right? So if we use as a proxy, I'm going to say proxy variable, and no, this is not going to turn to Econ 101, but I'm going to use a proxy variable here and say, if we look at the almost 300 billion, it's like between 250 and 350, depending on whose numbers you believe. Almost 300 billion that's come in to space via investments over the last 10 years. That's about, again, simplified model here, 10 billion. It's 10 times 30, so 30 billion a year. Okay, so again, you still got that big bucket. We'll take the midpoint, 60 billion from Uncle Sam across the period, 30 billion from commercials, they're going to other commercials, right?
Right.
So it says, okay, so that means that 2/3 of the market or more is still government. But it's that new 1/3 when they're making their decisions about how to allocate their budgets, how to do their business planning, they are contacting lawyers. They're also contacting economists and consultants and business people and people who can inform them on the lay of the land and train them appropriately and make sure that they're making great risk management decisions. But they're also reaching out to a lot of lawyers right now. And so I think that's why we're seeing this demand signal. It's because of that third right now of economic activity investment that's coming from commercials, and it's growing. Right, we're not close to the tipping point where it's 51% commercial, but it's growing, and it's growing quickly.
Right. Well, and I would say for those small to medium size space companies that are in growth stages and founding stages, especially important for them, right? Because they don't have that historical experience in working with those other entities that you were discussing there, or they're so far down the chain that it's unlikely that they're going to work directly with them to get that support. So
and I would say too, just to add to that, it's probably not just the small and mediums, because obviously you can't be in this business without knowing a bunch of space lawyers, right? And I also hear that larger law firms are reaching out to specialized space lawyers because they have clients that are Fortune 500 and even Fortune 50 who are saying, hey, what's going on with this whole space thing? We're looking at a space vertical. We're looking at how our products can be used for space. We need to retain these services and understand this market. So I'd say it's not just the small and mediums anymore. I'd say there's also some larger players, but not the traditional large player household names. They're also really getting interested right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we've spoken to quite a few large companies that are, like you said, they're transitioning and adding a pillar or a vertical for space. And I think that that's a great thing. I mean, the more involvement from new players that have experience in other areas that can bring some of those practices and ideas and new thoughts is really a positive thing, because otherwise we're this, self-licking ice cream cone of like you said, the same ideas coming around over and over again that some work and some don't, but we need new blood for sure to keep this growing. With that, one of the things that you've been talking about lately is biotechnology in space, and how you see that as a really important aspect of what's coming with regards to research in the economy and biotechnology. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that and how you see that impacting the industry side of it.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm super passionate about life sciences, med tech, biotech. I've already fully disclosed my bias, right? I worked in Genetics Lab for 3 years. So maybe I see things there, maybe that a little bit ahead of the rest of the pack. And I feel like everyone's going to start seeing this very soon. But, let's go through the advantages here, right? So if we just think about some of the demonstrations we've already seen about the printing of cells, right? The printing of cells, the experiments involving cells in space, it's really amazing. And we're talking about everything from the most recent announcements about meniscus, coming from space, right? Coming from space manufacturing. We've already seen prior to that a lot of research around eyes, right? Retinas and the like. This is just the tip of the spear. I think what happens next is really exciting. I think what happens next, particularly when it comes to biotech, is someone's going to invent their next blue pill or purple pill based on their space research. When that happens, you're talking about a tens of billions of dollars revenue stream for one of these exotic specialty drugs, like a new purple pill. And if you're at the board meeting where you have to describe to your board, like we'll just pretend you're Merck, why you didn't invent it, but Pfizer did, based on their space research, within a very short period of time, you're also going to be leasing space on a space station to do your own. and to come up with your next amazing pill and your next amazing breakthrough when it comes to biotech, life sciences, and pharmaceuticals. And they have the money necessary for participating in the build out and the industrialization of space. They can be some of the anchor tenants of many of these space station projects, these commercial space station projects that we're seeing. And so I think there's going to be that breakout moment, and that breakout moment that leads to the new drug or that leads to the commercialization of something developed because of space research. And again, whoever does it first, it's going to cause the dominoes falling. Everyone behind them is going to say, okay, we need to be here too. And I think it's a really exciting time. I think we're right at the cusp of it right now.
Yeah, well, and what I love about what you just described is it's a perfect example of space research and the use of space to benefit humans on Earth, right? Yep. We so often have to work on that communication to the larger population on why we should be doing things in space. And some of us have, different reasons with regards to the future of the human race and the survival of Earth and things like that. But at the very basic essence of it, right here, we're talking about developing things that can help people on Earth. And I read an article along this lines yesterday. Someone was talking about how we will never go to the stars and we will never populate the moon and the Earth and things was their premise, because it's too hard, essentially, largely due to the human body. They kept going on and on about radiation and microgravity environments and all the reasons that you can come up with on why space is hard on the human biology. The majority of the things that the person was talking about can be solved, rotating space station that provides gravity, shielding, whether it's water or other materials. There's all kinds of ways that I believe we will get to solving some of those challenges for our future astronauts on long duration flights that involve the exact same research that's going to turn around and benefit us here on Earth, such as I was thinking to myself, radiation and relation to cancer, right? All kinds of cancer research has been done here on Earth for a very long time. Now we get a chance to do it in space, where we can really use, cosmic rays and solar radiation and things like that to really experiment in ways that you really can't the same way on Earth. And I think you're right that everything from common ailments that we deal with here, but even life extension and, really how to help tune the human body to its peak performance probably starts to come from things we learn about solving those space issues that you just don't have to deal with here on Earth. So
yeah, I mean, I think you hit on. I think the article obviously missed some points, and you've hit on some great counters there. I mean, if we think about all of the money right now going into longevity research, where do they think that we're going to do these experiments? We're going to do these experiments in places where the cell surface area increases and where the space in between our chromosomes increases. And we can look at our genetics and our biogenetic markers in brand new ways, right? And it's also exciting because all right, so real quick, I'm going to put on the Professor Pullen hat. This is also a reason why everyone needs to take at least one good class on Socrates when they're in school, or go out and get the Republic and read it for yourself. Because if we think about, the allegory of the cave, Plato faced these exact same issues, right? Where he was telling people, well, those who don't want to be educated, what are they going to do? Oh, well, they're going to just, stand here and watch at the blank cave wall with the reflections of the fire, right? That's all they're going to do. Well, we're saying the exact same thing if we say, well, it would be really much too hard to travel across oceans. We're not built to travel across oceans. We're not going to travel across oceans. Or it would just be way too hard. We'll never do it. We're never going to travel to the moon. That'd be just too hard. We're not built to travel to the moon. These arguments have been around for more than 1,000 years.
Right.
And there's already some great rebuttals to them. Based both from a philosophy point of view that people should already be aware of, or also just from a economic incentives point of view. It does not take much to look at both the enduring love for space that exists within all humans and the importance of space when it comes to global power and great power competition, that there's going to be a lot of money spent in space, and there's going to be a lot of money that's coming down from space, and not just money, but breakthroughs and science and things that help Earth coming down from space over the next several decades. I was super fortunate to be on a show with Dr. C.M. Proctor back before she became an astronaut, and very famous now. But before she became an astronaut, and one of the things that she says is, when you solve for space, you solve for Earth, and it is so true. And we don't say it enough in our space community, and we don't share enough with those who would want to be part of our community, but they're so inclined to say no. And we need to solve this here. We need to fix homelessness here. We need to make sure that, I know you're a vet too, less vets are, addicted to drugs and addicted to all these awful opioids, right? We need to do something with that here, today, now. We have solutions to that are going to come from science, from space. They're going to benefit us down here. And we just need to communicate that better. And we're not doing a good job doing that.
Yeah, it's really a challenge. Absolutely. I think the space community often gets so excited and wrapped up in the new ideas and the glossy technology and the nuclear propulsion or whatever the new current thing that everyone's really excited about, and we lose sight of communicating the importance of these things for here on Earth. And the more that I think we can do that as a group benefits the entire thing. I want to change topics to lunar and cislunar, if that sounds good. So obviously we've got, a number of nations all pushing to get a presence on the moon. Congrats to India for their recent landing. That's, really exciting for them, and especially being, on the pole. I wonder about, when we talk about law and regulation and international politics and things, obviously there's a large faction that is out talking about peaceful uses of outer space and making it a place for all humankind and those types of things, which sounds wonderful to me. But the flip side of that, looking at the history of humanity, is largely a fight over resources between various groups, right? And so one of my concerns when we look at things like the Outer Space Treaty, Artemis Accords, and what's going to come forward from those into future types of agreements, a lot of treaties and things, the minute we go into a wartime scenario, for instance, those go out the window. And so part of me feels like whoever can get a presence on the moon first and have an astronaut standing outside on the moon with a shotgun wins the day, because they're there holding their property, if you will, outside of law, necessarily. But at some point, there's a real challenge there between the difference between the theory of law and the practice of reality and humankind, and how a nation can decide to do something outside of what everyone else has agreed on, right? And really throw a wrench in the mix for things like complete peaceful use of outer space or celestial bodies being for all mankind and things like that. So I'm curious about what you think about how we go forward in developing a framework that maybe can help try and divert us from that, or is it just a reality that there are going to be needs for security of communications and sea lanes and logistics, just like there is kind of on the naval side, as an example? How do you think that's going to work out in the next 50 years or so?
So if we look at ODSTs, right? So orbital drop shock troopers from Halo.
I'm familiar.
Yep. When you look at them, you see exactly the scenario that we're talking about here, right? It's somebody in a spacesuit. I'll just keep saying what you said, with a shotgun. A space marine who's defending a position, defending a post. we can look at one of two ways. We can say, if we get to there, we've already failed. Or we have to say to ourselves, we're going to get to there anyway. We need to prepare properly. Because just because he or she is standing outside with that shotgun does not mean they're using it, right? A lot of times, remember, right, defense, deterrence.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm, yep. Right, deny. It's not all about death.
Yeah.
And so let's just
in fact, the goal should be deterrence without war, right? Is the goal. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. That's why you have a standing military force. It is for the protection of commerce, and it is for deterrence. I'm not going to read your Constitution on you, but that's the whole point. That's why we have a standing Navy, right? And so if we think about space commerce, and we think about what it means to have resources and facilities and positions that are going to be on the lunar surface in the not too distant future, those will be protected. Now, does that protection look like satellites and look like relays and things like that at first? Of course it does. But as soon as to do, Bruce Willis from Armageddon, brought a gun to space. As soon as we start bringing guns to space, whoever does it first, everyone else is going to bring them too, right? And so we just need to plan accordingly for that defense and deterrence. And that means that the outposts and the research laboratories and the claims that U.S. and its allies, its armist allies, make on resources are defended and protected. It's going to be provided to them under, more than likely, the Space Force or the Space Force in cooperation with the Marine Corps. That's what it's going to look like. And does that make, how does that mean for their overall mission? If we think about the new mission statements that have come out of Space Force, if I was to summarize it up, and I can do that because I'm not in the military anymore, it's the purpose of Space Force is to protect the space economy, full stop. That's the purpose. Because what's the purpose of the Navy? The purpose of the Navy is to protect our global commerce, right? It is
Absolutely.
to protect the fact that 95%, right? It's probably higher than that. 95% of all international goods that change hands are done so via water. So you have to have a Navy to protect that commerce. We move back and forth billions of dollars in the oceans, and therefore we have navies and naval vessels to protect those. We're going to have the exact same thing when we're talking about returning resources and revenue and products from space. If you look at Bank of America's predictions for $1 trillion space economy by the end of the decade, or you prefer mine and it's 4 trillion in the 2040s, or you prefer the Chinese and it's 10 trillion by the 2050s, you're talking about the midpoint of those. You're talking about an entire continent's worth, more than Australia, more than Africa, more than South America, but an entire continent's worth of economic activity coming back to Earth. Those seaways in space will be protected and defended. Our partners will demand it. Our commercial entities will demand it. And we're not going to put that much economic activity at risk. And so I think that it's a natural progression. It's the exact same model that we saw with the seas. A friend of mine, Peter Garrettson, you guys might be probably know each other. He recently put out a great piece on what the blue water strategy for space might look like. And so I would recommend people read that. Yes, I'm a little biased because some of my estimates are in there, but you should look at it because it does lay out this, I think, in a very thoughtful manner, that we're talking about something that will need to be defended and we will need to have deterrence in place. I think when we talk about how this builds coalitions, I think that's a more interesting conversation, right? Because we already know what defense and deterrence looks like. How this builds coalitions is we say, well, we have these space facilities and we want to invite our partners. right? We want to invite our partners from across the Americas, North and South. We want to invite our partners from across Europe and Asia and Africa to come with us on this amazing journey into space. And we want your companies here too, and we want your scientists here too. And we can provide that blanket of protection for that economic development. Commerce follows the flag, flag follows commerce. This is a classic old economic debate, and we just know that wherever they go together.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. I was involved at the Pentagon and then at Strategic Command towards the end of my military career, making arguments for things with regards to the Space Force and kind of the direction it should go. I was always of the feeling that we should have made it a separate service from the Air Force, for the reason that ultimately, long term, I believe it's going to operate more like the naval forces, like you described, than like the Air Force. When you think about the Navy as being in a large vehicle for long duration periods in austere environments, it's a lot different than flying, an airplane from here to there. I think it, and like you said, the protection of sea lanes and lines of communication and logistics and all that comes with the Navy, it's a very similar model to what I believe the future of the Air Force looks like. So,
yeah, I mean, I think the way it's going today, and again, we're, so I mean, if you measure us in years, right? I mean, Space Force isn't even a kindergartner yet, right? So let's keep that in mind, and let's be kind to one another when we talk about it. I know you are being kind. I know you are, and you're a supporter. But I think if it's just us space nerds talking for a minute here, we should talk about the fact that we are still young, right? And what they're figuring out is still new, and they're bringing a lot of different elements to play. They're very strong ties and almost Marine Corps Navy type relationship with Air Force. Is that what it looks like long term? Well, Air Force eventually spun out from Army, right? So
absolutely, maybe
it spins out. I'll give you an alternative though of what it looks like, and what I've been thinking about is that if Space Force stays in its current mindset, which is predominantly a looking down and support function for the other services, then it's very likely that when it becomes time to look out, they will be providing look out services in a similar supporting fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means is that it's maybe Space Force providing logistics, observation, sensing, all of the other things, right? But that it's actually Navy that projects out. It's actually Army that projects out. If that's the way we stay today, and again, it's still so young, but if that's the way it stays, then that's what that ends up looking like.
Yeah, that's
a support service.
It's an interesting way of looking at it. A question I often pose to people when they talk about why do we create the Space Force and things like that, is I say, well, based on where the space industry and the space economy and where humanity is going here, and I know that this can be hard sometimes for people to think in these timeframes, but let's look out 200 or 300 years from now. Which military service 200 or 300 years from now will be the most dominant in how it affects our economy? It may very well be the Space Force, not the more traditional ones, right? Depending on the trajectory we take here with everything that we're doing in space. If that is, a major impact on our economy, well, then that might be the dominant force compared to some, older traditional ones.
Right. If we go to a model that, for example, Bezos has subscribed to, and actually many others have now come to see as well, where a lot of industrialization and production is actually occurring away from the Earth. And this actually answers many people's questions about how is space benefiting me? Well, if we're making things there, we're not polluting here. I mean, it's pretty cut and dry. If we move to that sort of model that Bezos has described in some of his speeches, then what you see is its interconnectedness to the world economy becomes that much more vital, right? It's not just about all the essential data that satellites are providing, because really that's the space economy today. It's all that data from the satellites. But if we go a little bit further out, like you're talking about the timescales of 50, 100 years from now, you're talking about a time period where a lot of industrial production might be in space. That's all transporting back to Earth for our benefits. It's going to be the main source of economic activity. And we just need to prepare accordingly. And it is much better. It's much better to be prepared now than later, right? You can have something, like what my dad always used to say, right? You have something fast, you can have it cheap, or you can have it good. You get two.
Right.
You get two, right? So let's decide we don't need it fast. Let's decide that right away. We don't need it fast. And then we can make this happen.
Yep, that's a very good way of looking at it. Well, we're coming close to the end of our time here, but I want to leave with something fun. So give me a few of your favorite science fiction / space related books.
Sure.
That have influenced you.
Right. So I love The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I celebrate pretty much everything of Asimov's. I'm also a big fan of The Expanse. I love Ender's Game. If I fail to mention what the number is that's the meaning of life, then my son will not listen to this. So I also have to say I love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And then in terms of outside of books, I'd say for media, if we're not consuming some new Star Wars thing off of Disney Plus, or if I'm not, consuming Deep Space Nine, so Star Trek. I love Next Gen still, but Deep Space Nine is what I grew up on. At least 1 or 2 episodes every weekend. Like something's just not right. So that's the picture I'd paint, and where my my love comes from. And I think that there's an important connection between literature, and I will also include art, and the space economy. It's the thread that connects it. We have to have imagination, and that imagination is watered, right? Those seeds are watered by the art that we get around space, from the imagination of science fiction writers, from the producers that bring us such amazing, new shows around our favorite characters. So I think that it is an important part of it, and I'm glad you asked me that question to close.
Yeah, I think it's important. There were certainly works of all different types of art forms, like you said, that I found inspirational. And then when we look back at ideas that have been generated that may become reality here regarding space and some of this, a lot of that came from early science fiction, and so that creativity and excitement that comes along with it, I think really helps translate into both motivating people to be creative and thoughtful in their ideas, and then also keep them excited about what the future has to hold. So yeah, I appreciate you answering that one, because I like sharing that with people to give them new ideas, especially younger groups, that haven't been exposed so much. So
if we don't start thinking about what it looks like to recruit the Space Force Academy class of 2035 or 2040 now, then we're not going to have the guardians we need in the future. And that goes the same for the entrepreneurs and for everyone else. And I really don't think that's been part of anyone's strategy yet. It needs to be.
Yeah, I love it. Well, George, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
I look forward to it.
Thank you very much.